So I'm not sure how thorough I'll be with this. I just wanted to do a quick audio in reference to these topics just to kind of keep up with the pace of things, I suppose. And also just to not disregard it, because sometimes I'll have ideas and then I'll just kind of put it to the side for a significant amount of time and then I just don't come back to the topic. And so I'm just challenging myself to articulate it for now, and then maybe I will expand on it later. But some of the question is, within these religious discussions with Judeo-Christianity and Islam and etc., and as pertaining to whatever these suppose should fit with a sense of universal aspect of life and existence, right? And so then it draws into it. Everybody that's affected by these proposals or claims, because these are ultimately universal claims as to God, creator, life, existence, etc. But anyway, so some of the question is, what is the scripture, what is God in the scriptures actually trying to do? And I think if we at least suppose and understand what it seems like God is trying to do as pertaining to the revealed attributes of God, then we can suppose what avenue, like what was he resolving? And then ultimately, what was he trying to accomplish after that? And I think if we can understand that much, then we can look back and question what approach did he take and why through that mechanism and that approach of change and transformation were things so confusing, and why were there these symbolic acts and confrontational acts, and why does God seem to do some of these or introduce some of these various claims and whatnot. So on a simple note, what it seems like is, so if we look at the story in Genesis in the garden, we're introduced to this scenario of creation, and creation in relation to God. And so we have this sense where we, as part of creation, in this web of creation, are, how would you say it? Like, we are out from God. We are portions created out from God. And so it does reveal this sense of, I don't want to say like subservience, because later we see this attributes of God as God is love and whatnot. But we do see this sense of like a positive dependence, in a sense, interdependence, I guess you would say. We are of this service of creation. We have these attributes of refining, cultivating creation as unto our Creator, God. And we find that there's certain stages of attributes given to us for growth. And so anyway, so without getting too much into this whole, like a big old, like a expansive research project here, just on the simple note, we see that it seems supposed that with certain attributes of creation, that we are to develop into further stages of understanding and evolving as unto God. And so we kind of get this, what it seems like to me is we get this hint that God desires for us to grow in relation to God with further revelation unto attributes of God in life. And this would take upon the certain connection for our experience as we are portions of God, out from God, but we are limited as we are in God, in the sense that we only exist as being portions of God, portions of attributes, delegations, if you will. And the in-between that we experience then is these spiritual attributes. And as they coincide with these spiritual attributes and us being built in this connection and reference unto God and then God, there seems to be this mechanism for us to grow and generate and evolve and develop. And in inward spiritual generating and quickening and understanding and discernment and all of these things. And so that seems to be what we're supposed to do in creation. We have these attributes where we recognize this standard of God by which is given to us as the standard of this life mechanism, this tree of life in this story. And this warning against the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's so much supposed about this story, where I think it's correct that when people read the story, they feel like there's something in error about it, right? So I guess I'm just going to assume you're familiar with the story in Genesis, right? And I think it's correct that people think there's something in error here. Like there's already an error here. It does read as though it's like this neutral ground, this place where it had not yet fallen into sin, and almost like this perfection, right? And then there was the fall, and then that introduced this corruption. But what it also reads like is that so I'm trying to simplify this without going too deep into it. So we get the scenario of mankind in creation, the network of life in God. And then we also, so that's what we find that God is resetting us to, right? We find that God is setting us in relation to that standard of living and existence and whatnot. And that seems to be an attribute as to what God is up to. Like that's what God wants. Us to live and flourish in life and grow and develop along those lines. But there's also something else that God seems to be doing, which is cautioning us against distortion, against likenesses and distortions that function through these mechanisms, of which create horrific responses through these components and mechanisms by which we're created. So then that gets into the story of the Satan or the fallen powers, or what people call like Satan, demon, devil, what have you. That could also be different, but I guess I won't get too complicated there. There's different ways by which you can look at the different characters functioning there. But anyway, there's this warning. What coincides with it is that we just don't automatically develop into the initial intent of God. We can fall into false likenesses and traps and false systems and false developments. Another major portion of the story, a major intent, is to prevent us from falling into what develops into the fullness of that corruption. And once we get involved into the entanglements of that corruption, how to then get out of it and then reestablish this setup that is like the main initial intent to get back into this alignment with God. And so we find that there's certain difficulties in the way the story develops once we're entrapped in this entanglement, right? Another major portion as to how the stage of the Genesis story reads is that it had already happened. There had already been the corruption, the systems that develop unto the world, the mechanisms by which they have infiltrated, and the distortions by which it develops into, and then becomes a major competitor as to what God is, what the attributes are. And so then it seems that it develops into what we see later in Genesis as it introduces the conflict and the difficulty of the riddle to understand, like in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the garden scene, the Garden of Eden. But we see how it starts to develop. It gets off course, right? There's so many different interpretations as to these functions, like the fallen kingdom, the corruption, What kind of powers do they have and whatnot? So what we find, though, is this example where it gets drawn into this error. And even now you'll hear like atheists and world-renowned, like scholarly people suppose, like, I just don't see the error there. I just don't see the difference between, say, the tree of life and then the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why would God be like that? Why would God say, don't partake in this tree of the knowledge of good and evil? It's just, it's really confusing to understand why that's the dilemma. And so people suppose about this in so many different ways. Why is that the dilemma? So what you start to find as the story unfolds is like, here's the dilemma right here. God created things with this purpose in mind, this ability, and it looks like this. And it's distorted into such a false likeness that it looks like this. And even if I introduce it to you, you don't see what the error there is, to the point where you tend to defend the growth built through the mechanism of this skewed system. So then that's a major error. So then we get this long story portraying that people don't understand the distinction of God, and they ultimately then become, through deception, caught up in this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They don't understand the error of it until it develops into these major systems of corruption. And so we get this long story introducing what that looks like, because a huge part of the story is it in a sense absorbs all of the mechanisms that should be attributes unto the development and building of God, and it causes these developments and this build up in this dominion to be that which is difficult to discern between at its stages, reaches to the heights of a massive competitor unto that which is otherwise God. And so what we find in the story is the difficulty to discern between these corrupt systems and God, and how difficult it is to get back to this reset of God, and how it develops into these systems that at the height then replicate such a level of corruption that eventually it leads into those among those dominions participating in the very thing that keeps regenerating that false idea or belief in God. And then ultimately it causes, eventually at these heights, it inhibits spiritual freedom. It eventually causes those within it to corrupt the mechanisms of mankind. It then pins the very life mechanisms against each other to generate power. And ultimately then, as it says in the New Testament, creation then groans, right? Creation has then become brought into this mechanism where it's, in a sense, kind of like a parasitic overthrow of God, where we're trapped in these systems where the very mechanisms by which God created us to flourish are being used against us to generate these false images and systems of God. So then we get this story, right? It's such a peculiar story, to the point where it even says in the story, we can't understand God. We have a hard time understanding and discerning between this, because every mechanism built in us functions through preserving life and pushes forward to preserve life, which is caught in this system, which generates the distortion of hijacking life. So it's this is mostly what the story seems to be like. What I'm suggesting is God is trying to both preserve those trapped in this system, so save us, preserve us trapped in this system, but in such a way where we understand, and it kind of becomes this like surgical process, but in such a way where we understand the attributes of God, where we understand the lies and the schemes and the things we've gotten caught up in, and we also understand the error of the system. And so we learn these strategies, right? And we learn these ways to slowly shift back unto God. And ultimately, then, the story is it's a liberating story. And it's to free us into the dominion of God outside of these corrupt established dominions that supposed to be in the animated power of God, but they basically just have connected themselves to attributes of life and God and whatnot to prop themselves up with these mechanisms. So it's to free us from these false dominions and the attributes as to what they eventually become, to help us understand how to not keep regenerating those same systems, which actually we see does happen when people are trying to free themselves. They get caught up in the mechanism, and this is what is difficult and I think this is also why it's introduced as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and as opposed to the tree of life, which includes good and all of the good. But the reason why I think it becomes confusing, and it's addressed like that, is it's kind of like this mechanism where they say the battle is of the mind, right? There's this battle of the mind where the story reads as where people are caught up in a system of deception and distortion for so long, they don't know how to discern between the different portions, and it's hard to convince them that the system is wrong. And that's why it's more appropriate to say the knowledge of good and evil, where it uses good to develop evil in an incorrect way, and it generates evil to utilize good. It's kind of like one of those I forget the exact quote, but the quote is something to the effect of something along the lines of, it requires people thinking that they're fighting for good, for evil to be like generated. And in a way it could be, in some ways though, it's almost like we become forced to do that. You know, maybe you can think of like the game, The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games is a movie. There's probably a lot of other examples too. The Hunger Games is a movie where people are confined into this like large area, this walled-in area, and they're forced to they're forced to use their mechanism in them, the attributes to preserve life, to preserve their life, to defend life, to select for life. They're forced to use those mechanisms, which are like part of what is good about us, but they're forced to use it to fight other people in confines that are directly intensified to make life have to do that, to push people into survival modes where they have to choose different degrees of life and the destruction of life. So different degrees of the destruction of life as the mechanism to preserve life. And so you see it becomes this huge distortion, right? What you find when you're observing, you're watching that movie is like, you just keep hoping like the mechanisms outside of it would free people so that they don't have to be limited into these confines where they have to fight to the death. And you see this duplicated throughout a lot of systems throughout history, where you'll have the ruling parties thinking that they're functioning in the mechanism of preserving God and preserving good and preserving the dominion or preserving the system. And then they have people entrapped to fight out the attributes of what it actually is generated like, where they have like the gladiators trapped in these systems having to fight to the death of these other systems. And then you think, why can't they just free that? And so then you find like on a systemic level, there's so many levels where it's forced into those confines because the ruling parties then take on these attributes where they don't know how to preserve the system and the benefits, the good of the system, without generating these tensions to keep people at odds with each other. And it just inevitably keeps duplicating and regenerating and claims an imagery of God, but then it's a competitor of the otherwise freedom of God, similar attributes of sanctioning and occupying forces over groups. So all of these things, right? We keep seeing it generated and generated. And then to keep it going, they have to propagandize the idea of certain preservations of life selected against other groups to diminish life so that they, so it's just this continuous pinning life against life, right? So, as I said, that's not to say there isn't good. Like Jesus would say, all good comes from God. So basically, when people were generating these divisive storylines and propaganda storylines, Jesus isn't falling into this divide, these manufactured divides where the systems need the enemy to feed off of so that they preserve the good, so that they're fighting this quote unquote evil, and it just generates all over the place. That's not to say that eventually evil internally isn't generated. It is. And so then that also intensifies this continuous battle. And so this is what we see in the story is how to get out of this cycle. How do we break out of this cycle? And that's what a lot of the story is yes, you have components where you're preserving life and you're building these qualities, and then you have people where it's improperly generated against them to generate a scapegoat or to generate hostility or what have you. And it also introduces the need to dismantle that divide. So the need to dismantle that divide that the system generates off of, the need to understand what God is actually like so that we don't just recreate another similar system, which we also see that happens in the storyline is other groups defeat the other groups thinking they're going to free the system, and then to keep it going, they create another oppressive system. And then eventually, internally, there's this generating divide. The generating divide then has to be free, has to overthrow the powers keeping the system going, and then they think they're going to free the system, and then they generate the divide, and then there's another ruling party, and then they generate the divide, and there's another ruling party, right? And this is the riddle of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the system. It becomes a system. And so we're confronted with this story where it says, hey, the claim of Jesus is we've broken from that. If we understand what the revelation of this is, we've broken from that dominion. And so as it says in the book of Revelation, it's the tree of life. We've reached the mechanism to point everything to be dismantled toward this new quote unquote ruling class, but it's not really a ruling class. It takes that whole mechanism and breaks it toward what Jesus claims is going on there unto God, and pulls it all into then being regenerated into the kingdom of God. And so that's what we see is happening there. And it's supposed to be this attribute of this return to the initial stage, this return to the tree of life, and breaking out of these developed rise and fall of these corrupt systems and improper divides. So then the question is, okay, so God's trying to free these cycles, this distortion, this deception that has gone over in humanity and causes creation to groan, misuses the things of life, and pins us against these generating battles, right? But then how? So how are we not seeing it? How do we understand it? So then that's what becomes a lot of these storylines. People will kind of maybe hear what I'm saying and say, oh, this sounds familiar with the story of Jesus and Christianity and whatnot. And then they'll say, this is what Jesus did for us. And in some ways it is, but I probably am interpreting it a little bit differently as we get into the internal stuff, looking at the question as, if we see what we're going toward, this freed kingdom, freeing the earth and creation unto being referenced in this return toward this alignment with God, our creator, as we experience it as being built into in parts of creation of God, but then inwardly we have the Spirit of God that connects us and is the mechanism by which we grow and generate a different type of evolving within us, then we return to the intended mechanisms for growth, right? But why is the process so difficult? Why is it so difficult? And so I kind of outlined why it's so difficult. For one, it's because in humanity, we don't understand. All of our mechanisms are being built toward fighting, this fight to survive. And it's hard to, because it's become that also, so it's hard to understand how to walk back from what it has become. Our very striving for living generates that error of that system. So then we get these practices that intervene and portray what was God doing then? What were the mechanisms of transformation internally to get us back to that reset unto the standard of life? And so this is where I suppose where there's this question as to why, besides just deception, or is it just deception, does it seem like these powers, these rulers end up having this power? Do they actually have a certain power that they've tapped into? Or is it the deception that taps into the mechanisms of life that give them that power? Or what like what's kind of functioning there? Is it, like the story where Satan has certain delegated power, the Satan character, or, like the devil character? He has certain types of power because it was delegated from God, and he uses it to distort creation, to force God's hand by holding all of creation hostage through this systemic development of corruption. And through this, he causes, humanity to generate these systems, of which then at the height of it is this death, this full-blown death drive, as they say, like philosophers and whatnot, where it has to feed off of this error, kind of like a parasitic attribute unto all of creation. And then some question, well, is there a power there? Is it because God delegated certain power, gave certain power, not full power, but certain power to the devil character, and he's used it to generate more power? Is there actual power there, or is it just the appearance of it? And this is interesting too, because Jesus talks about this in his parables, right? He says, the children of light, something to the effect of those that are striving, basically I'll paraphrase, those striving to be in the spirit and generating corrective measure of God are not as conniving as the establishment or the businessmen or various ones. And then he gives this parable about how they feel like their reign or their power is short, right? Because they find that, this one, it gives this example where Jesus starts to eventually give a lot of examples through the market system. So what's also really interesting about the storyline, and this is another major component to seeing how one of the mechanisms by which this transformation would occur, is that eventually it starts to be seen that attributes of humanity, the trait of life, the physical examples of the trait of life, are utilized then through food, through trade, through the market. And eventually then money becomes a way to follow powers and rulers and mechanisms and the things that they do and the systems that they develop. And so money does eventually become a huge component in this whole rearranging of this system and whatnot. And so Jesus uses his parables in various ways to put various ones in check based on how they attribute themselves to money. And so there's this one where he's talking to, and here's the thing, it's not all evil, it's not all bad, and that's not what Jesus is saying, but it's the very systems by which you develop and function through and draw your attributes of success through. And so, we all know that at this point in time, right? Money can be used for usefulness, for life, increase of life unto the good, or it can also be used for destruction and power and corruption and all of these things, right? And so Jesus is also introducing to them that it's not always obvious how it's being used. And so he introduces in saying some of these businessmen and whatnot, systems, they know how to introduce what seems to be life-giving to people by decreasing levels of their enslavement, or so it'd probably be better if I looked at the, like, expounded on the parable. But the parable is something to the effect of, there's this like shady business guy, and he's just the worker bee of, I shouldn't say worker bee. I love bees, so I don't want to say. He is the worker unto this other higher up, right? And he gets word that he's going to be fired because he's not getting enough money. You know, it's a very oppressive system. A lot of like overlords, right? He gets word that he's going to be fired. And so he thinks, what am I going to do? Like, the only thing that I've been messing with people so long. I'm seen as like a scoundrel. And so he confronts this sense like, all right, I'm going to be fired and nobody likes me now because we've been messing with people, and the guy over me is messing with me, and there's just no loyalty here. And so what he does is he goes and he tries to pretend that he's helping everybody. And he's like, okay, the only like a currency that I could use here is I mean, this could be used in different ways. It could be seen in a variety of ways. I'll get to that. But basically what he does then is he reasons like, okay, my currency is that I'm caught between this even more evil guy that has no loyalty. He's going to just let me go even after all of the evil that I've done for him and corrupted the people and enslaved the people. And now people aren't going to like me. And so I'm caught between the people and this corrupt leader of whom now I'm privy to his his rule, right? And so what he reasons then is, I know what I'll do. I'll generate loyalty from the people to me, and I'll take that loyalty from, well, they're not loyal to this like ruler. They're afraid of him. And so I will go out before I'm fired. And since I hold the tabs at this point in time of the accounts or what have you, or maybe not the, what have you, I will go out and I'll pardon them. And I'll change their names in the books. So let's say he goes out then and he's like, hey, so-and-so, how are you? And they're afraid of him probably because they're like, oh no, he's going to come and he's going to tell us like we need to pay the fees that we owe or go to jail. And he's like, guess what? I'm feeling very kind today. And obviously like I'm expounding on the story. He's like, I'm feeling very kind today. And so instead of that $50,000 debt that you have, I'm going to lower it in my books to $10,000. And I just wanted to let you know. And they're like, oh my gosh, what a relief. I'm relieved that I'm not, for one, going to jail, and that you've lessened your approach to us, and that now I don't owe as much. And so they're like, that's great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. So he goes around and he does this with so many people and everyone. So he gains this reputation of like, he's really freeing us. And so he earns that favor, right? And one of the points here is that Jesus is portraying to various ones when they're just trying to like hold to this certain standard of corrective measure. He's showing them that, okay, some of you are trying to hold to this certain pure standard of corrective measure, and you're losing to the crowd because here's an example as to how they generate favor. But it's also, what also seems to be happening there is he's saying, you're correct in that as children of the light, he just means like trying to like preserve the spirit. He's like, you're correct in that you're assessing that they're wrong, that it's not really freedom. They're playing the system. They're gaming the system. You're correct. But you're getting played by the whole perception, the public perception, because you don't know how to discern how to correct this, how to have a breakthrough. So the corrupt systems are gaming people and playing people, and you're playing into it. And they also, because they've established those connections, if you budge on their dominion, because also when in a roundabout way, here's the thing. The guy regains favor to the overlord because he increased in oppressing the people in an even trickier way. And so he reclaims loyalty to the overlord, because the overlord is like, wow, you did great here. That is some clever stuff that you did. Like, congratulations. And so he re-intensifies the connection with them. And the very people that the people think they're resisting, like, they intensified their adherence to that system, right? So what God seems to be saying is this whole thing is whack. Or Jesus, speaking unto trying to formulate this revolution of this greater breakthrough. And he's like, you're already vulnerable to them. You're vulnerable to them because they have this occupying force of the system. And you're also vulnerable because they know how to leverage the people. And they know how to pin the people on you if you challenge them too much. The overlords and the propagandists and the ones wielding these powers and influence over the people, they know how to either utilize the occupying force directly or the improper pressure of the people, because they've put people in a place of needing to adhere to them, or it would be even worse. So what we find then is this very skewed and deceiving version of these occupying forces and the people. And so one thing they have going for them, the skewed forces, the corrupt rulers, is that people don't understand what's going on. They don't understand how to go and shift towards freedom. And they don't understand how even the claims for freedom have also become occupied and leveraged. And so then this is a massive part of the story as to what is this question of actual breakthrough. And so I was saying this story can also be looked at in a different way. What we find is that the story of Jesus is also similar to this. So this is why Jesus actually, not in a distorted way, not in some of the skewed ways we've seen, but this is why Jesus actually is an interesting character, because he does a similar thing that this businessman did, and he understands the mechanism, but he does it in a way unto God, to where he slowly delivers things to be unto the dominion of God, in a way that then will have the actual attributes of freedom, the actual attributes of life, and freed from the rulers and dominions. And so that's what a lot of the story is. And through that, then we have the symbolism of some of these things that enter into that skewed state. The way that Jesus does some of this is through using a similar mechanism where God enters into the corruption, but he uses it in a way where he gets these rulers to invest in some of these other likenesses and some of these other things, which eventually they will try to insist are their eternal claims to these ties of dominion. But it's done in such a way where eventually it just checks out. And then it shifts it all to both be understood unto the dominion of God, understood unto the freedom of God, understood unto the attributes of freedom. And it just really exposes eventually, what these limited, divisive, generating conflicts unto these world rulers really is doing. And so, in a sense, Jesus becomes this character that, whether the devil or the Satan character actually has some delegated power or not, Jesus then becomes the character that puts it in check and transforms that and claims it all back unto God through these other mechanisms. The claim then of Satan, devil, what have you, would be, you can't do that. You can't take back the very delegation that I've been given. And so then becomes a story is, how does that happen then? How does God, through Jesus, reclaim this connection as unto God in heaven, even if the devil, Satan, had corrupted it among earth to draw out these powers to hold earth hostage so that he can control God by holding creation hostage? How does this change? So this is a story. It's a peculiar story. And there, I do think at some level, some of what becomes very peculiar is that God enters into the strange claims so a lot of the strange claims that we're confronted with is among what's called like the devil's dominion. And eventually none of that is attributed to God's character. And well, maybe there's like partial truths and whatnot. We have to reclaim the portions of life and good and love and redeem people from false claims of where they're entrapped into likenesses of evil, but they're not evil. It's a very much redemptive story. It's a peculiar story. But anyway, I just wanted to talk about that. And so I'll leave it at that for now.